Evening and welcome to this week's edition of Walter Rodney Groundings. I am David Hinds, sitting in for Dion Abrams this week. Of course, there's quite a lot to talk about. There have been a lot of political developments this past week. And to help me walk through some of these developments is executive member of the WPA, Tacuma Ogunseye. Tacuma is a political activist and who is also a political commentator and long-standing member of the Working People's Alliance. Tacuma, welcome to Walter Rodney Groundings.
And thanks for having me, David.
For the purposes of getting our viewers to really have a sense of your background, your both political background and otherwise. You're from Kitty.
I'm from Kitty. I basically is a city person. You know, I went to school at St. Ambrose School, Anglican school, and then when the government introduced the secondary school program, my school and Christchurch School, I think Kingston School merged into Christchurch Secondary, and from Christchurch Secondary there I did my secondary education. Basically, I have been active involved in politics through ASCRIA, which is the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, headed at the time by Brother U.C. Guyana and others. There is where I began my real political activities. I remember Stokely had visited the country, Stokely Carmichael, and he had a lecture or two at the Plaza Cinema, which is very close to Christchurch. And myself and Godfrey Sage and a number of other students went over, and we were very impressed with Stokely's message. And I remember, you know, Stokely was a very powerful orator, but he always leave his audience with something, you know, that you could hold on to. I remember that afternoon he invoked a passage from the Bible that there are no remissions of sin without the shedding of blood, you know. And we as young people were very impressed generally by his argument that black power, by black power he means black power for African people. He made a distinction between Pan-Africanism as a political and social force as against other interpretations of black power. So we found it very interesting. And Sage, who seems to be more aware at that time of ASCRIA activity than I, told me that we should go and, you know, join ASCRIA. And I went over, we joined ASCRIA, I met a brother UC, and so on. From there onwards, I began my political activism until we emerged into the WP.
Let me stop. It's interesting that you mentioned Stokely Carmichael. And for the audience, Stokely Carmichael, who later became Kwame Ture, was born in Trinidad and Tobago, and migrated to the United States with his parents as a 12, 13-year-old, lived in the Bronx, was a very brilliant student, went on to Howard University, and then became part of the civil rights movement. He was one of the founder members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was like kind of a youth arm of, unofficial youth arm of the civil rights movement. For those of us here in Guyana, the SNCC, as it was called, was something like the YCT, a kind of unofficial youth arm, as YCT was regarded a few months ago, unofficial youth arm of the APNU. And SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was the youth component of the civil rights movement. Carmichael became chairman of SNCC, and he was the one who uttered the famous words Black Power. Now, the concept of Black Power had been around long before Carmichael, since in the 19th century in the United States. But one day they were marching, I think it was in Greenwood, somewhere down there in the south. They were marching in Mississippi, I think, and the police had tear gassed them. They were attempting to assemble in a schoolyard, and the police turned the tear gas on them. And Carmichael took the mic and went up and said, you know, we're tired of begging in this country, and what black people want is power. And they said, what we want, and the crowd responded, black power, and the concept of black power. Just to give the audience a sense, especially the younger ones, who Stokely Carmichael was. And Carmichael was invited here in Guyana by ASCRIA, I think it was 1966. I may have the dates a little bit, but he was invited, and it's that that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. So, so you were introduced into politics in the era of Black Power. Yes.
Sorry.
Tell us about a little bit about that Black Power movement, and what is it? What the message was?
Well, of course, the Black Power movement, as it evolved in the Caribbean, was really a political, cultural message. It had a very strong African awakening message, trying to revitalize the African consciousness in the region and to link that consciousness with the motherland Africa. And it also had a very strong nationalistic and regionalistic message, a very anti-imperialist, a better word, strength in the Black Power movement. And I think that it was the movement at that time that really awakened, not only in Guyana and the wider Caribbean, a whole generation of activists who became involved in the political process throughout the region. And Guyana, benefited from that. I remember when the banning in Jamaica of a number of Caribbean personalities, and so the impact in Guyana was very, very profound. And a lot of the young people in the country and the region at that time, got a kind of awakening to political activities, and it really began to shape our political consciousness.
All right.
It continued throughout the region now.
Let me stop you and take you back. ASCRIA, the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, which you joined, was formed in 1964, in a sense predating the Black Power movement. So in that sense, ASCRIA anticipated this Black Power movement. What was the context for the formation of Africa in 1964? Because before that, there was the African Society for Racial Equality, which was formed in 1961, was disbanded, and then ASCRIA was formed in 64.
I think ASCRIA in 64, came into being to fill that very vacuum that was created by the disbandment to the organization that you mentioned, but also because 64 was very important in the independent political struggle, and of course in Guyana, politics and race has always been very closely entwined. And I think by 1964, I think Brother Guyana and others in ASCRIA felt that it was not enough for us to simply depend on the conventional political party, the PNC, to be the sole spokesperson or the sole representative of African interests in the country. I think we recognize that political parties have limited interests, and sometimes they don't best reflect the genuine interests of the ethnic constituency. And I think that ASCRIA was formed in order to give an authentic expression of African interests and African developments. And more importantly, ASCRIA from its very beginning understood the importance of a political solution that is based on some form of multiracial reconciliation. And we were not, I think they were not too sure that that could be achieved simply through the political parties. Hence, ASCRIA felt that those who found ASCRIA at the time felt that they need to do something to create an organization that could do those both things: strengthen the cultural revolution among African people, and to create a political basis for the kind of long-term politics which we believe African interests will be best looked after in terms of the whole national interests.
Very significant, Ogun, because you said ASCRIA was cultural nationalist in terms of the cultural moorings and the groundings of African people. But it was also profoundly political in the sense that it dealt with the political issues of the day. But very importantly, it was it had a multiracial content in the sense that it sought to organize African people for a political solution. But also, it was not just a black organization, it was a black organization that was grounded in the working class, among the working class blacks. Speak to that.
Well, of course, Guyana and ASCRIA basically was an organization that was really grounded in the ordinary African people, the African working people, farmers, young people, youths, and so. We really fundamentally believe that, I think this is where ASCRIA was a little different from most ethnic organizations in the region. We have always inculcated in our philosophy some understanding of class. In many African organizations and ethnic organizations, they tend to dismiss class. The class doesn't exist. They emphasize the unity of the whole race. In ASCRIA, from very early, we recognize that in the African community, there is need for ethnic unity, but there's also need for class analogy and analysis, so that the profound interest of the great majority of African people who constitute the working people and the poor and the powerless, that their voices and their interests will become the fundamental goals of the organization. So ASCRIA was very class conscious in that sense, and we represent profoundly the interests of the African working people, farmers, unemployed, women, and so forth.
In case you're just joining us, this is Walter Rodney Groundings. I'm David Hinds, and I'm talking this evening with Tacuma Ogunseye, political activist and executive member of the Working People's Alliance. We've been talking about Ogunseye's early entry into politics in the Black Power movement in the late 60s and the early 70s. So this evening's program is going to be in 3 parts. This first part, I'll talk to Brother Ogun about those early days of politics, and then we'll take a break and we'll have an edition of what we're calling Day Clean WPA Speaks. For the old timers, they will remember that one of the newspapers, news sheets of the 1970s and 1980s, the organ of the WPA was called Day Clean. It was a very subversive paper in its day, and certainly part of the radical history of this country. So we've named the part of this program Day Clean, in which we will feature the views of the WPA on the issues of the day. Today we are going to have the WPA's views on that nasty racist editorial from the Guyana Chronicle, which has been in the headline these past few weeks, and also the WPA's statement on the first anniversary of APNU. Yes, this past week, APNU celebrated its first anniversary, and the WPA put out a statement. Sister Tabitha Sarabo will be the presenter of that section of the program. Day Clean, WPA Speaks. Ogun, let's fast forward. You talked about Stokely Carmichael, you talked about Guyana, you mentioned the bannings in Jamaica. Obviously, we're speaking about Walter Rodney, who was banned from Jamaica, but he was not the only one banned. Clive Thomas, who is currently a co-leader of the WPA, well-known economist, was also banned from Jamaica during that period. Tell our audience how and why a black government in Jamaica, all right, in the late 1960s, we were already independent. Here is a black government in Jamaica banning black people from Jamaica for talking about blackness. Speak to that.
I think it has to be understood in the class dimensions of the society. Though the government in Jamaica, was a black government because it, the economic interests that the government seeks to represent was not black capital, was white capital, aligned with indigenous, white Jamaican capital, and I think that is basically what the government was representing and defending. And therefore, anything that they see that threatens the political status quo that will endanger, from their point of view, the interests of capital. I think they felt that they had to move against it. It's the same kind of problem one will ask in Guyana. Why would Burnham, a black regime, move against Walter Rodney and other black activists? You have to find the explanation both in terms of the personality of the leader, to some extent, but more profoundly, what interests that group of leaders, feel that is their principal and primary interest to defend. And as the politics play itself out, if it threatens that interest, I think they will act in defense of that interest, and this bring them into contradiction with the whole question of being a black government and dealing with black activists. It is the class interest at the end of the day that determine the behavior, and also the personal interests. As in the case of Burnham, it would have been more, in my judgment, more personal than even class.
Personal in the sense of his personal hold of grip
power.
and power. Let's fast forward, and I didn't intend to take you so quickly here, but let's fast forward to the present. Does this PPP government represent the interests of all East Indians, or is it the same case where they represent a particular class interest or group interest?
It is clear that the PPP, the present PPP regime and party does not really represent the interests of the Indian working people. And if you look at the rebellion of the sugar workers, the sugar workers are the first set of organized Indian opposition, public opposition to the government, and not by accident. See, the Indian sugar workers have always been a vanguard, to borrow a term from the old days, in the struggle to defend their own interests and generally working class interests in the country. And it's not by accident that Indian sugar workers, who have been for a decade the backbone of PPP's political strength, were the first to begin to show open discontent, with the government. They're the first set of organized Indian expression. And I think it clearly speaks to the fact that the regime does not represent the interests of the majority of Indo-Guyanese. I remember after the PPP came to power, there was an Indian comrade, he's a business person, I don't want to call his name. He lives on the East Coast. He's very active in the Indian community in North America. And he met me in Kitty, just around by the market. He said, "I'm going to come, I want to talk to you." And we began to talk. He said, "I want to tell you something, He said, this PPP regime, they alliance with some racist Indians in North America. He said, they don't even know what they're really dealing with. He said, black people in Georgetown here in trouble. That's early 92 after PPP, when he said, y'all in trouble going. I is there among those elements. And I hear the discussion and tell you they're extremely racist. So I think it is, the PPP have been gradually taken over, by external forces and internal elements who really don't have the interest of the majority of Indian working people, and they really represent a very narrow interest of one of the most reactionary sections of the Indian community, both in Guyana and in the diaspora. So I think it is fair to conclude, and I think anybody will conclude, that the Indo-Guyanese interests, the vast majority of them, their interest is not really served by the PPP. I don't think the PPP will want to doubt that these days.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me take you back, Ogun. Let me take you back to the early 1970s. ASCRIA in 1971 broke its relationship with the PNC. It supported the PNC from 64 to 71, was never part of the PNC, was independent of the PNC, but gave it political support. In 1971, ASCRIA broke with the PNC, mainly on the question of corruption, but largely on the question of with the direction that the PNC seemed to be going. Significantly, there was an open, if you will, a break between Guyana and Burnham, and the PNC responded in a particular way to ASCRIA. Talk a little bit about that response.
Okay, I want to say ASCRIA did more than support the PNC. In fact, I think ASCRIA actually brought the PNC and Burnham to power. Burnham and the PNC had fairly good standing in the city. in the rural African community, Burnham and the PNC really had some great difficulties because the country people had some problems with understanding Burnham, this urban phenomenon, this, very well learned, lawyer who sometimes carry his message far above the heads of the people. And it was Guyana and ASCRIA that really did work in the African community to help to unify that community behind the PNC so that the PNC could get the maximum political support in the African community, and that was very decisive in the PNC and Burnham fortunes. It was also ASCRIA and Guyana who helped to give Burnham a positive image in the African, and the progressive African movement throughout the world. We brought the Pan-African Secretariat here and so forth and so forth. So ASCRIA did more than just support the PNC. I think we were very instrumental in bringing them to power. And I think having done that, we felt when things began to go wrong, I think ASCRIA felt that we had a bounden duty as an African organization who have contributed so tremendously to bring the PNC to power, that we had a responsibility to speak against the corruption that was developing in the party, in the direction which the party was moving. And more importantly, there's a moral issue which I think that eventually broke the camel back. Corruption was one thing, but then a phenomenon developed where African women were coming into the ASCRIA complaining that when they go to ministries looking for jobs, the ministers were asking them for sex. So African women were being exploited in a very vicious way. And I think that broke the camel back. And I think at that time we decided that, look, we have to, even if it leads to a rupture between ourselves and the PNC, we have to speak out on it. And we spoke to Burnham privately. Guyana was instructed to speak to Burnham privately on corruption and all of the problems. And Burnham's response was that, I didn't really hear, we actually call names. We call Green name, or we call other people name, David Singh name, we call, so and so and so. And Burnham said, I didn't know hear but then I hear about Reed. That's Ptolemy Reed, which was then the deputy leader of the PNC. And Reed at that time was considered one of the most cleanest of the PNC leaders at that time as far as public perception goes. And right away we felt that Burnham was beginning to play games. But anyhow, he went on the air and he said that anybody who have evidence of corruption should put it to the ombudsman. He started to office of the ombudsman and so forth and so forth. So after many months of, we decided to test it. And we decided to carry both Hamilton Green, and I think it's David Singh, to the ombudsman, and this is where the trouble started. You see, Burnham was prepared to play games. He gave, a lip service to the corruption and drive, but once you begin to be concrete and to put his ministers on the front line, then he began to behave differently. And that, led to, a whole series of repressive actions by the PNC against persons who were members of ASCRIA. And at that time, the YSM and ASCRIA was very close in many communities, and it led to the rupture. But I think that 1973 elections was very decisive in ASCRIA's political approach to the PNC. You know that in 73, the PNC carried out a very massive rigging of the elections. It was very blatant. The armed forces was even organized in a rigging. And ASCRIA felt that, this was carrying matters a little too far. And as an African organization, we met and we believed that we came to the conclusion that the African long-term political interest is not really tied in continuing rigging the elections, that we need to fight for political solution. And we began to accuse the PNC of rigging the elections, which worsened the political situation. But that eventually led to the formation of WPA. We fast-tracked very fast the formation of WPA, right. And subsequent developments. But ASCRIA, in whatever we did, we were guided by two things. the ethnic interest of African people as a constituent, the class interest of the great majority of African people, and what is best for the national interest. And we couldn't see a Guyana that will lead to the liberation, the profound liberation of African people, without the liberation of the Amerindians and the liberation of the Indian people. So we always felt that whatever the solution, it has to result in the joint liberation of all the Guyanese people. And we felt that as from the African community, we have a responsibility to lift the politics of the African community to a revolutionary level to facilitate that development. And that is basically has been the guiding vision that guided ASCRIA, and I think it still guides many of us who are active in the WPA, who came from the ASCRIA roots, that we see the liberation of our people as tied in the total liberation of the entire nation.
The voice of Tacuma Ogunseye, WPA executive member, political activist, giving us his lesson history, the history of the 1960s and 1970s. I'm going to come back to some of those issues raised by Brother Ogunseye, because we're now going to take a short break and have what we are calling Day Clean, WPA Speaks, which is presented by Sister Tabitha Sarabo. So don't go anywhere. Walter Rodney Groundings will be right back.
Thank you, Dr. Hinds. Good evening. Welcome to today's edition of Day Clean WPA Speaks. I am the presenter, Tabitha Sarabo. This week, we will feature WPA's views on two issues: the Racist Chronicle editorial and WPA's statement on the occasion of the first anniversary of a Partnership for National Unity. WPA is disgusted by the shocking Guyana Chronicle editorial of June 2nd, 2012, Opposition Rampages to Sow Disunity in the Country, which profiled African Guyanese youth as violent and racist towards Indian Guyanese. According to the Chronicle, these youths are socialized by the opposition to rob and murder Indian Guyanese. The editorial concluded that hatred of Indians is ingrained in their psyche. WPA views these statements as emanating from a racist mindset that has long characterized part of the national discourse on race relations in Guyana. The editorial represents both an assault on the dignity of African Guyanese and an insult to the intelligence of Indian Guyanese whose fears it purports to highlight. An editorial that sets out to speak against racial division has ended up doing more damage to the cause of racial unity than any in recent times. WPA has long acknowledged the fears of both major ethnic groups, but it has always warned against the identification of a guilty race. We reiterate that position today. The identification of African Guyanese as the guilty race by the Chronicle, the newspaper of a government that is predominantly representative of Indian Guyanese, has serious consequences for national reconciliation and unity. WPA therefore condemns in the strongest terms the highlighting of the fears of one group while indicting the other group as the worst form of racial incitement. We also draw attention to the fact that the editorial utilizes the narrative of the violent African to condemn the ongoing protests by the predominantly African Guyanese community of Linden over the electricity hike arbitrarily imposed by the government. This is unjust to a community which is merely exercising its constitutional right to protest what it views as government overreach. The WPA has over the years become concerned at the ease and frequency with which the Chronicle has allowed its pages to be used as a medium of racial insult, particularly against African Guyanese. Since the Chronicle is the official mouthpiece of the government and the de facto mouthpiece of the PPPC, and given the fact that after almost a week neither the governing party nor its government has distanced itself from it, WPA is forced to conclude that the editorial represents the views of the government and ruling party. WPA has no choice but to declare its total loss of confidence in the editor, editorial board, and official management of the Guyana Chronicle. It is high time the use of the state media as instruments of political and racial abuse comes to an end. There is no doubt that the Chronicle has forfeited all claims to impartiality and national standing. WPA therefore urges the general public to, at the very least, begin a boycott of the paper. Do not buy it. We have also instructed our parliamentarians to explore ways to have this matter raised in Parliament as one of urgent national concern, and to urge the National Assembly to hold a hearing on the entire operations of the Chronicle and other state-owned media. WPA calls on Indian Guyanese leaders and organizations to speak out on this matter. To remain silent is to condone the public racial lynching of African Guyanese youth in particular. WPA also reiterates its call for a national conversation on race and racial reconciliation, which must include the Amerindian community, with the aim of civilizing our public discourse and facilitating an environment and culture of racial respect and a spirit of racial justice. Finally, WPA continues to believe that the realization of a national government premised on racial and political jointness is an effective way to minimize racial fear and insecurity and usher in a spirit of national consensus. WPA joins with our partners in a partnership for national unity in observance of the first anniversary of the partnership. Our party decided to join the partnership out of a deep commitment to political and racial unity, not just as a slogan, but as a living manifestation of how to forge the joint nationhood that is so necessary for Guyana's survival as a viable nation state. After 1 year, we are heartened by the progress the APNU has made on this front. The presence of the APNU on the political landscape is a demonstration of the possibilities for achieving that joint nationhood where all are meaningfully involved and none are marginalized and are dominated. Not only has the partnership remained together, but it has extended that spirit of unity and jointness to include a working relationship in the National Assembly with the Alliance for Change and an attempt at a broader unity through the medium of the tripartite talks. The APNU has in 1 short year managed to excite a new political awakening among the Guyanese people, particularly the young people who have been the core of the partnership's energy. WPA salutes those young people and urges them to remain engaged in the process despite the many obstacles in their way. We also recognize the sterling work done by the APNU Parliamentary Caucus, particularly around the budget. WPA has not agreed with all of the tactics and decisions of the APNU this past year, but we recognize that as part of the dynamics of coalition and partnership building. A partnership by its very nature is different from a cohesive party with entrenched structures. Here we wish to invoke the words of WPA's co-leader, Professor Clive Thomas, when he spoke on behalf of the WPA at the launch of APNU a year ago. In life, as in politics, it is clearly easier to work with those who share your own point of view and are prepared in effect to echo solutions you offer for creating reconciliation, peace, and harmony. But just as in life, you reveal your humanity by embracing diversities of views, different outlooks, and different participants, so too in politics you reveal your political culture through a willingness to embrace diversities and differences in promoting strategies aimed at reconciliation, harmony, and the reduction of conflict. Members of the partnership should be heartened by this common wisdom. In closing, the WPA hopes that in the coming period, the APNU moves with more vigor to do the following: deepen the democratization and strengthen the organs of the partnership, spend more time and energy in the ranks of the people where they live and work, listening to them and learning from them. Make a more deliberate and concerted effort to advance the agenda of a government of national unity, including putting constitutional reform at the center of that agenda. We shall now return to Dr. David Hinds' interview with Tacuma Ogunseye.
To Walter Rodney Groundings, I'm David Hinds. My guest today is Brother Tacuma Ogunseye, WPA's executive member and longtime political activist. Brother Ogun, before we took the break, we were talking about the stance taken by ASCRIA, an African organization, against an African-led government on the issue of corruption and other government overreach and so forth. Let's fast forward to the present, because we have an Indian-based government in Guyana today. And the question of corruption is even more pronounced today than it was 30 years ago when ASCRIA took on the PNC on that question. Do you see the same kind of vigor on the part of the Indian Guyanese social and cultural leadership in terms of speaking out against this government?
No, it is clear that, except for the certain individuals, like what you come to mind, Freddie Kissoon, Christopher Ram, and probably one or two other Indian writers in the AFC and elsewhere. There is no organized Indian opposition to corruption that is consistent the way in which ASCRIA did to the PNC, and I think that this is a profound weakness in the political equation, and I think it do a great disservice to the interests of the Indian community. It seems to me that with the birth of the PPP regaining political power in '92, the influence of the Indian diaspora and the money class in the North American diaspora, both in the United States and in Canada, I think they have been able to exert a stronger influence in Indian politics in Guyana than the organic local Indian organizations. And I think that the local organizations have been stifled by the aggressive racist policies that have been preached by a lot of the activists that came out of the North American experience. If you look at the way the Indian engagement in Guyana unfold, particularly after '92, you get a sense like they're behaving like how the Jewish lobby behaves in America, where anything the Jew or Israel do is right, and any criticism how legitimate of Israel or Jewish behavior is treated, with violence, and they bring to bear the total economic and political power to flush you out. I think it's some of that politics that have been, pervasive in Indian political engagement, and I think it is that negative North American intrusion into Indian Guyanese politics that is responsible, to my mind, to the great silence of ordinary legitimate Indian organizations to speak out. I think they feel politically intimidated. I also believe that you have to look at the way in which the PP have been using the state. The PP have using the state to transfer tremendous material and economic benefits to its constituents, not the masses of Indian Guyanese people. You got to make a distinction with the masses and the particular, clique that is the beneficiary of this great push of wealth using the state to the Indian community. But they do have a trigger effect that influence the politics of the whole constituency. So a lot of Indian opinion, are silenced by the fact that they feel that the PPP vindictiveness will affect the economic benefits that they get, or that they hope to get from the state. And so there's not that kind of sustained and deliberate engagement that ASCRIA did, because ASCRIA was working, from a more clearer political ideological position, and not by any economic interests of any section of the African petty bourgeoisie in any way. If we were influenced by the economic interest and the broad interest of the African masses, which give us a kind of freedom to engage, to represent that interest. But I think the situation here is that a lot of Indian organizations are so dependent on the goodwill of the state, directly, indirectly, that they feel very threatened. They're being oppressed the same way and intimidated, where many non-Indians, are intimidated by the aggressiveness and the state.
The lesson here, Brother Ogun, is that in ethnic politics, it's very important when there is a kind of ethnic self-criticism, which is what ASCRIA was engaged in. And that is very important in terms of bringing equilibrium to the system. And where that ethnic self-criticism is absent, the system tends to get out of control, which is, I think I hear you saying, is part of the problem here with this present government. But let us hasten to say that at the last election, sections of the Indian Guyanese community voted for the AFC. I mean, they didn't come all the way over to the APNU, but voted for the AFC. And that, it would seem to me, would be a step in that direction. Would you say so?
Yes, I agree. The last elections demonstrated that there are positive movement in the Indian Guyanese community, political movements in the Indian Guyanese community. And the AFC at the last elections clearly was the beneficiary of that movement, and I think it's a good thing. I do also, I also believe that the Indian community, suffer from the way in which its spokespersons, even those that mean good, present the Indian Guyanese. We're now going to a very ticklish kind of interpretation here, and I have to be careful. I have listened to Rafidel from a number of Indian activists speak about Indian personality, and they portray an Indian that is extremely weak, that will be easily intimidated by anything, any kind of expression of African activism. They see that as intimidating Indians, we see as threatening to Indians, and I think that they undo Indian consciousness, and they help to to suppress their own people, even though they don't settle to do that. But the consequence of portraying Indians as weak and as any little rev up by Africans, frighten Indians into the nutshell and drag them back behind the PPP, I think that is overdoing, and it's a tactic that, even though it may look as though it's being effective, it is doing a great disservice to the consciousness of Indian people, because people needs to have a sense of their own internal strength as the basis for their political activism and the ability to fight against oppression. And to portray Indians as weak or easily intimidated is not in the best interest of Indian political development and the whole country. I do believe that the Sugar Workers' Rebellion, which I believe is key to the shift that took place at the elections. I think when the sugar workers began to act out and to show that they are prepared to engage the PPP and the Jagdeo regime in a certain way, I think it gives substance, and it gives inspirations to other sections of the Indian community to vote against the PPP, because if the sugar workers could come out in open opposition, it becomes much more easy for other sections of the Indians to go in their ballot boxes and to vote, protest vote against the PPP. And I think that is what the APMU, the AFC benefited from, that protest vote that came from the Indian communities, speaking against the excesses of the Jagdeo and the PPP regime. And I think is a positive development, which I hope will continue to develop. But I'm also worried the way in which the AFC is using it. You see, the AFC, having been the beneficiary of the Indian vote, there tends to be hedging the politics that, that they have to protect that vote.
Sure.
They have to protect that vote. It's a kind of electoral opportunism. And I don't think it is healthy to the Indian community. I think if people vote for a party, it means that they're expressing a willingness to have that party to lead and to provide leadership for them. And the two things, the growth of the two things must go together. And Indian leaders in the AFC who were the politically beneficiaries of the shift in the Indian community have a duty to lead the Indian community further progressively to national unity and reconciliation. And they have to guard against the political opportunism of believing that they can't go too hard against the PPP because they're going to lose the Indian vote the next time. I think, the Indian elements, Brother Nagamutu and others, Moses and them, they have to understand if they really want to give justice to the people, that they have to prepare to lead them further and further away from the PPP and don't, succumb to electoral opportunism.
And of course, there's precedence to this, Brother Ogun. Your party, the WPA, which came out of a similar situation in the 1970s, multi-ethnic party in terms of its membership, but its really early intervention came in the African Guyanese community, in particular in Linden and in African Guyanese, part of the urban community, in some of the villages like Buxton and so forth. But they took a stance of using that, as you were saying, to really go aggressively after the government at the time and not engaging in that kind of what you're calling electoral opportunism. Let me quickly get your view on this editorial, because I think a lot of what you've been saying, that editorial that we've been talking about these past couple of weeks, that editorial, I would venture to say, comes out of the politics that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I think the editorial was extremely racist, but to me not surprising. You have to understand the dynamics of race and politics in Guyana. Once the APMU, accepted the rig elections, as the barometer to determine who get political power and how the executive power of the state will be organized, you created objectively, in the context of Guyanese political engagement, you created objectively the platform for sections of the Indian community to feel empowered that they have pulled another one over the African leadership, and you created the condition for ethnic excesses. And I think the editorial politically has to be seen in the context of the post-election engagement, because Linden is a reflection of the post-election engagement, and the editorial have to be seen in that way. I have no doubt that the PPP approach to Linden in terms of these electricity heights are intended to punish the community for voting against the PPP, because the PPP had based its electoral calculation that there would be a landslide. They based the thing on two things. They felt that they had the Indian community locked off, but they felt that they did enough work in Linden and many sections of the African community that they were getting a significant African vote, and Linden was key to them, that would give the landslide. So when Linden voted overwhelmingly for the APMU, I think the Jagdeo regime and the PPP decided we have to settle scores, and I think the electricity heights is part of that approach. The editorial comes out of that engagement, that the person who wrote the editorial fashioned the editorial as a reflection of the objective thinking of the PPP leadership, and they seek to represent that in an editorial. And so it is not by accident that the state media allowed that to go through, because I'm telling you, any editor reading that editorial would have known that you have to think 2 and 3, 4 times, and even to seek advice outside yourself whether such an editorial should be allowed. The fact that it was allowed, clearly was a political clearly was political. But I'm glad that those of us, those persons who came out and spoke out against the editorial, came out very forcefully and forced the regime and the editorial board of Chronicle to make some backward step. But I think that we have to see the editorial as a reflection of the post-election engagement, and to my mind, it is that unfortunate compromise that the APMU made on the elections that allowed the PPP to hold on to the executive authority of the state, that to my mind is responsible in the main to the attitude of the PPP and the outcome as in that editorial. I think the two can be separated.
Cannot be separated. Ogun, let's talk a little bit about Walter Rodney, relevance to today. In previous programs, we've talked about who Walter Rodney is, was, his work, and so forth, so we don't want to cover that ground. But as someone who worked very closely with Walter Rodney in the Working People's Alliance, and who is au fait with his whole approach to politics, given what the elections have thrown up, how do you think the Rodney ideas can be used to engage the situation?
Okay, profoundly, I think Rodney ideas in many areas are very relevant to the challenges we have in the society today. I think first and foremost, Rodney believed that the liberation of any people is based in the self-liberation activities of that people. And I think that even though elections are a manifestation of people's involvement and their choice, and it has its usefulness, I think the Rodney position would be that you have to recognize the limitation of the electoral engagement, and ultimately what will come out of the quality of life and politics that will come out of the electoral engagement depends upon the extent to which the people, the ordinary people, engage the political process and force the political equation forward. So I think the first important lesson that we can learn from Rodney thinking is that whatever is the political situation, the role of the people is critical in determining the outcome of that political process. So what the election threw up, what we call a new political situation where we have the government control the executive, we control the executive, and the combined opposition control the legislative parliament. I think it is probably the best in a bad situation. I really believe that we should have gone for the jugular, and we should never allow the PPP to hold on to the executive power once we find them engaged in electoral rigging. But put that aside, I think that the parliamentary engagement would not by itself make any significant difference to the equation unless the people enter the political process once again. And I think that while the parliamentarians do their work in the parliament, we have to develop a mass grassroots movement of the people to really bring back the people involvement in the process. I think the young people in the YETC did an excellent job in mobilizing particularly the African Guyanese youth and to bring them back into the political process. And I think that the APMU was a beneficiary of that process, so the whole country benefited from that process. I think that the future of the country lies with a similar coalition. And I'm worried that I'm hearing some negative vibes about the YTC, which I don't want to discuss because I'm not too sure I understand all the developments. But objectively, one would have hoped the YTC would have remained as a coalition and try to use its experience and its impact on the political process to engage Indian Amerindian youths to widen you know, the youth involvement in the politics, because it is a very important development. And if we allow that coalition to disappear, I think it will be a great a weakness in the political process in the future. And I think Rodney's idea, Rodney is very strong that the youth, young people have an important role to play. And he is very strong that, you know, you have to allow, the political parties have to allow young people and sections of the community to find their own voice and to find their own road along, their own way along the political road.
And that's Brother Tacuma Ogunseye, political activist and WP executive member, who's been my guest today on this edition of Walter Rodney Groundings. Ogun, thank you very much for coming on to the program today and sharing your insight with us. Before we go, I just want to take time out to salute the people of Linden who are on the streets and on the move defending their interests. This past week, the WP, along with Red Thread, invited some other organizations, the PNC, the APNU, the TUC, the AFC, and all the other organizations to come out, and we had a picketing exercise in front of the office of the president. About 100 people showed up. We intend to continue to organize similar events in solidarity with the people of Linden. So keep your eyes out. And let me quickly say to the people of Buxton, I was there for a funeral yesterday, and so many of you said to me that the work we're doing on Walter Rodney Groundings is so important. We have so many viewers in Buxton, I suppose, all over. I want to hail you up. Until the next time, I want to say good night and thank you for tuning into yet another edition of Walter Rodney Groundings.